Turner Ashby. That he was beautiful and perfect. Just looks like every single one of our kids. He had dirty blonde hair and big feet. Long, skinny, big feet and big hands. He was just beautiful, and he's been a beautiful part of our life.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a place where moms and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Winter.
And I'm Lee. We are grateful you joined us today. Please note that this is a story of loss and has triggers.
Thanks to our lost parents who are willing to be vulnerable and share their children with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, just know that on our YouTube channel there are pictures and videos that are related to the stories that are being shared.
Subscribe and share it with a friend that might need it, and tell them to subscribe. Why? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they're still a part of us. Desiree, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your sweet Turner. And I'm so grateful that you reached out to us, because I feel like that his story is going to be really super impactful, and I'm excited that you get to come on and tell his story today. So thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, I am very glad that you guys are doing this, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to finally share our son's story. So
yeah. I know you mentioned when we were talking ahead of time is that you have not shared his entire story, and so we feel honored to be able to do that for you today. So just a little bit about yourself, Desiree. Can you tell us what your family looks like, maybe at the time of when Turner was born, and then kind of what it looks like right now, and then kind of go from there?
Yeah, so at the time of his birth, we had 4 children, and he is our 5th. Our oldest was 11 at the time, and our youngest was 3. And we lived outside of the greater Columbia, South Carolina area. And yeah, stay-at-home mom, all the things that come with being a stay-at-home mom of multiple children. And at the time, I was also over the primary organization of our church. So I led and did all this stuff with the children at our church. We're very involved with our church, still are. And a wife of an amazing man. I'm so blessed to have him. And I also have, coincidentally, a master's degree in counseling.
Oh.
So didn't know when I got that degree that I would eventually need it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Wow. You just sound so busy. Like I am just amazed. I was like, okay, you had 4 kids at the time, and
yeah.
you also homeschool your kids. Is that right?
Yeah. So at the time we did not homeschool.
Oh, okay.
But we knew we would eventually.
Okay.
We were waiting until the middle school. That's when we started. But even that kind of started earlier with some of our kids. So it's been an adventure, but it's been a long road getting there. But we've been doing that this is our 6th year. So,
wow. That's impressive. Whenever I hear people that homeschool, I'm like, good on you. My daughter would be like, Mom, stop telling me what to do.
Yeah, it's a lot, but I love it. It's been good. So
awesome. And you guys are very involved in your in your church, your religious organization, which is great. I just want to point out, because we are of the same religion, and the fact that you were over the primary organization, which is like basically the kids from 18 months all the way to 11, 12-ish. And that's a big range of kids, and really cool. And I think we'll probably play into a little bit of your story today. So, and what do you guys like to do as a family?
We just like to be together. We all do jujitsu. My husband and I haven't been active in the last year. I had an injury that kind of took me out. And then just this past year, with personal issues, I have not gone. But so we enjoy doing that. All of our kids are involved with that. And our son's in Boy Scout. One of our sons is in Boy Scouts, so we're involved with that organization. all of the kids have some sports or activity of some sort going on, and I'm taxi service. But our oldest just got her driver's license, so we're hoping that will no longer be the case most of the time.
Yes. Yeah, I know. I was like, yeah, you really are taxi service and chauffeur for a good chunk of those years, huh?
Yeah, but we just enjoy being together. Like, that's the most important thing for us. We don't really care what we're doing. Yeah. Although we do enjoy being active. We work out. We do a lot of things as a family. Mm-hmm. Our kids probably hate the workout sessions. We're very active together.
That's cool.
So, yeah.
That's awesome. And are you and your husband from back east, or was this kind of a move for you that was unexpected, or, I mean, because, just.
Yeah. So I'm actually from Wisconsin and my husband's from Alabama, and we've lived in South Carolina since 2011, December of 2011. So we've been in South Carolina for a while,
which is nice.
But it's not our home state, like where we're originally from. But it's kind of home now because it's the longest place we've ever been. We will have been married 18 years this December.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So, and I'm assuming, are your families, parents and stuff like that in Wisconsin, in Alabama, or are they?
Yeah. Most of my family's in Wisconsin. I do have a brother who actually just moved to like 30 minutes away.
Sweet.
So he's here. We moved 2 years ago to the Aiken, South Carolina area. Mm-hmm. And so we're right on the border of Georgia and South Carolina now. But I do have a brother who lives nearby now. And his family, my husband's family, is actually where we lived. We actually lived in the same subdivision as his mother and his brother.
Oh.
And 9 houses from each other.
So close.
So they're nearby. His family is, but mine is not. Most of my family is not.
Okay, that's good to know then. Okay, and then as just a kind of point of reference, how long ago from the time of this recording was Turner born?
So it's been 5.5 years. He was born on March 25th, 2017. So it's been a little while. Yeah. It doesn't feel like it, but it does at the same time.
Yeah.
So time becomes strange.
It really does, especially with loss. And thank you so much for coming on. I just can't tell you enough, because we interview a lot of women who are kind of fresh from their grief. Yeah. And so to be able to talk to somebody that has a little bit of time between the loss and now is very helpful. I think it will be extremely helpful. So thank you again. Okay, well then, so you have 4 kids at the time, and was Turner planned? Was that a surprise pregnancy, or was it kind of like, was he part of the plan to get pregnant again, keep adding to the family?
Well, we always knew we wanted a big family from the moment before we even got married. We were buying diapers when we were engaged. Like, that's yeah.
You're totally planning a honeymoon baby, huh?
So we knew we wanted a big family. But by the time we got to when he was becoming part of that plan, we didn't know after our 4th one if we wanted to have another baby. And I was not in a good place mentally or emotionally. I had gained a ton of weight with all of my 4 previous children.
Yeah.
And it just took a toll on me. And just raising 4 kids, I just wasn't sure if we were going to have another one or if I wanted another one.
Yeah.
And I finally got active and lost all the weight and was in a really good place. And that took about 2 years after I started working out, about 7 months after our 4th was born, and lost the majority of the weight, was in a really good place. And then it's like, yay, I finally recognized this woman in the mirror again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I just had an impression that we needed to have another baby. And I was like, what? Like, I don't know if I can do this again. Yeah. And I've always been the kind of woman, mother, I don't know what you want to say, but like, it's always been a very spiritual thing for me when we know we need to have another baby. It's like there's this other little person that's like, I need to be a part of your family. And it's a very strong pull on my heart. And Turner was definitely no different. And so I dealt with that for about a year. And finally I was like, okay, all right, well, I guess we'll give it a go. And we've never struggled with fertility issues. Very easy time getting pregnant. Never had any complications with any of my babies or pregnancy, never experienced loss, nothing. And got pregnant immediately.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so he was planned, but not until I was ready to give into what I felt God was telling me I needed to do with our family.
Yeah.
So.
Which, thankfully that's time frames can be different, right? So it's
yes. My timeline was certainly not his, but once I got on board with that, then I was like, okay, I guess.
Okay, so then you guys got pregnant, and how was that? How did that pregnancy look? Did you guys did you go in at like 12 weeks to just make sure everything looked good? I mean, how were those first few appointments for you?
Yeah, so everything was great. I am really sick in the beginning with each of my babies, and usually until about 20 weeks. And I actually found out that I was pregnant with him after I returned from a trip visiting my parents, because my parents are dentists and I needed to get some dental work done. And at the time, I didn't want to bounce working on my teeth. So I flew back home. And so it was unexpected, but kind of expected, but it was an unexpected surprise and very pleasant surprise. The first ultrasound, I had at 8 weeks and everything was great. I saw midwives for my fourth child and also for Turner, but they are the OBGYN group. Yeah. That deliver at a hospital, and really enjoyed the care that I had with my fourth child. And everything was great. We found out with all of the other kids what they were. Turner, we did not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he was supposed to be our last.
Yeah.
I wanted one baby where we were surprised.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm like, this is my last time we're ever going to do this.
Right.
So I want to be surprised. And I have a lot of regrets with it, but I've learned to be okay with it. Because knowing what I know now and knowing how his story ended, it's kind of a lot of conflicting emotions with that, because I feel like I deprived my family of really getting to know him while I was pregnant with him.
Yeah.
But we were all excited while I was pregnant of being able to find out when he was born. Yeah. So I try to focus on that.
Yeah.
So we did not find out, but with all of my babies, I knew even before I knew.
So I
knew he was a boy.
Okay.
And we, at the time, had 2 girls, 2 boys, and girl, boy. And at the beginning, I was like, oh, this trend, and we're going to have a girl. And then the further along I got, I was like, no, this is a boy.
Oh.
Definitely a boy. And he looked great. Everything was great. Had routine, just the routine ultrasounds. And I don't think we did any of the blood testing that they do now.
Like genetic testing or whatever.
I was pretty confident in the ultrasound, like at that 20-week anatomy scan, finding anything. And my pregnancies were all pretty low risk. And so I didn't have any real worries about that. And if there were worries, I knew we would be able to handle them.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of my mental state of being at the time.
Yeah, totally. No, it's good. So the 20-week ultrasound looked good. There was nothing that of concern. Placenta looked good. You looked good. He looked good.
Everything looked great. He looked great. He was being stubborn and wouldn't show us all parts of his heart. And so I had to come back in, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks later.
Yeah.
So I think the first one was around 18, 19 weeks. And then the next one was around 22 weeks.
Okay.
And and we finally got the images they needed, and they were happy with what they saw. Just didn't really have a care in the world. Looking forward to getting to the 24, 25 week, viability age. But he looked great. He was always really stubborn though, and the ultrasounds with hiding his face or not being in the right position where we could like really get a good view.
Right.
That last ultrasound at 20 weeks, we finally got a really good look at his face. And I cherish those ultrasounds because his little hands up by his face, and you could just see. And in one, he was even like smiling.
Oh.
So I really cherish those. But everything was great.
That's wonderful. And just kind of bringing back to the point that you don't know if it's going to be a boy or girl. Did you guys have like a running list of both sets of names, or that's always tricky, right? I mean, names are hard in general, I think.
Yeah. So we've never really had a problem with girl names, but boy names, our boys, all of our boys were not named until they were born, but we had names picked out, but they didn't actually have a name until we left the hospital. Like the nurses were like, hey, this baby needs a name in order. And he was very much the same. We had a boy name and a girl name. Yeah, so we had that, but it took us a while to get the boy's name. The girl name, I don't think it took us that long. Our girl's name, we never questioned. They were like, that's it.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, we definitely had a girl's name and a boy's name ready to go.
Oh, super fun. And at the time, so it sounds like your youngest at the time was around 3-ish?
Yeah, so he turned 3 while I was pregnant.
Okay.
So December birthday, and Turner was born 3 months later.
So he was probably pretty excited. Like, I bet that was a big deal. And
yes, he was very, very excited. And his name's Andrew. And he is just this little independent human being, and always has, like, started crawling at 4 months old, walking by 8 months. Like he takes the world by, he just is ready to go. And so he was definitely ready to be a big brother.
Oh.
And it was just so sweet watching that little connection that he had with him. And every single day he'd talk to him in my belly. And, and the other kids were excited too. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But Andrew was definitely very excited to have a baby.
That's so sweet.
Yeah.
So everything is progressing just fine. All of those appointments were looking good. And then it wasn't looking good. Like, tell us kind of what happened, events leading up to.
Yeah, so like trying to figure out where to start. There were a couple of things that happened like during my pregnancy where you know the statistics going in. At least I did, having been pregnant so many times. I was always concerned about miscarriage. But I wasn't ever concerned about stillbirth. I knew it happened, but I always thought it would happen to unhealthy babies or to babies that had problems or pregnancies that had problems. So that was never really something I was ever concerned at. But for some reason with his pregnancy, I was always intrigued with those stories. And I found myself reading a couple of stories and just being like, oh, that's so sad. That's so sad. I can't imagine going through that. And I look back on that now and I was like, was that a way of preparing me for what was to come? And so I never had that happen with any of my other babies where I would hear somebody's story and actually read it while being pregnant.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of different, being pregnant and doing that. I right around like 34, 35 weeks, I had the flu really bad.
Okay.
But baby was fine. I was fine. There was just a bunch of illnesses that happened from like January to March.
Mm-hmm.
And, we got multiple kids and they were at public school at the time, bringing home pink eye, flu, all these things.
Right.
And I think about that now. I'm just wondering, like, none of it contributed to it, but that was certainly a part of like, well, was it that? Was it that? But as far as his actual pregnancy, there wasn't really anything that that let me know anything was wrong.
Yeah.
And although the last 2 or 3 days, I felt like something was off.
Okay.
That's the only thing I can really think of. I was very active with my pregnancy with him. I lifted weights until I was 35 weeks. I ran until I was 32 weeks. He was one of my healthiest pregnancies I've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
I did all the things.
Yeah.
And so everything was beautiful. But when I replay the events, those like specific things come to mind because I never really did those with my other pregnancies or thought about certain aspects of other people's stories of loss. But for some reason, I did that with him.
Now, Desiree, was he quite active? Like you could feel his movements and all of that?
Yeah, so he was a mover and a shaker. He always was moving. He was so active. I mean, he had very active times during the day. Morning was always active right after I ate. And right before I went to bed, he was always active.
Yeah, okay.
And I have a lot of photos and a lot of videos of my pregnancy with him, which is, again, I never did any of that with my other kids. And I'm very thankful for them now.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize at the time that was all I was going to get. So I feel like a lot of these things, like it was almost like God was preparing me for this. And that's why I bring them up. And I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't have those things, like, that's not God speaking to them, but for some reason I felt like God was preparing me for losing him. And I just didn't know it at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I have lots of pictures, lots of videos, lots of all of those beautiful memories with him. And about a week before everything happened, we took our kids to it was called Frankie's Fun Park. And it's just this like arcade and go-karts and all these things, because we wanted the kids, our family, just to have like a good time before we brought this baby home and have one last like hurrah. Yeah. Before life turned upside down with the newborn, and and because we've been through that 4 different times, and we know how life just,
it's so
very
different.
Chaotic.
Yep.
New baby. And we definitely got that, but I'm so glad we did that with them because our life changed in other ways. Right. Not with a newborn, but with grief instead. But I'm so glad we have those memories now to think back on. Just the fun that we had that day. Yeah. And then let's see, there was 3 days later, my husband at the time, so he's an attorney, and he worked for a private law firm at the time. And there was another lady in his office that was also pregnant. So they threw both of us a baby shower.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah. And that happened 2 or 3 days before we found out that he had died. And I was almost 38 weeks when he passed. I don't think I mentioned that yet. But I remember that baby shower just being a beautiful time. And the other woman who was pregnant, there were some signs that her baby might have some complications after birth.
Okay.
And I just remember feeling so badly for her that her baby was going to have life-limiting complications. It turns out he was just fine when he was born.
Oh.
But I remember thinking about that and just being like, oh, that's so sad, that she has to go through that, and I'm going to bring home this healthy baby.
Yeah.
And, but the shower was beautiful. And I have to mention that I got gifted this little teddy bear lovey. Mm-hmm. And just those little blankets that has the stuffed animal on the end. And I was looking so forward to giving that to him. Because none of our other kids had that wasn't really like a thing. Yeah. It's amazing how time like
Totally changes. Yes.
Like everything changes, like with what you give babies and what's popular at the time.
Yep,
So
exactly.
I was really looking forward to him having this tiny little blanket that he could have, because you're not supposed to give babies blankets in the crib. And so I was like, oh, he gets to have this little snuggly thing with him. And but yeah, it was a great day. Another day went by, and then another day, and on March 23rd, no, it must have been the 22nd. I think it was the 22nd. I can't remember exactly, but it was 2 days before he died. So it was the 22nd of March. I remember sitting on my couch, and my husband was getting ready to leave, and all of our kids were at school. He was getting ready to leave to go to work, and all of our kids were at school, and Andrew was at home. And I just remember looking at him as he was going out the door, and I just said, his movements just haven't been quite as active as he's been. Like, he's just kind of sluggish lately, I've noticed. And my husband's like, well, should we be concerned? And I'm like, no, he's fine. I'm getting towards the end. I've got 2 weeks left. They run out of room.
Yeah.
And, that's what they tell you. Mm-hmm. And it was our 5th. And I didn't have any cares of the world. I was at the finish line. And I'm just like, well, he's just probably getting ready to be born and just doing what he needs to come into the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'll mention it tomorrow at my midwife's appointment. And he's like, okay, that's fine. And left, had a normal day that day. And then on the 23rd, I had a midwife's appointment and mentioned to them that his movements were just off, that they weren't as strong. Yeah. And they just felt really soft. And that's kind of what I just said. I was like, it's just, I really didn't think much about it. Yeah. But I knew enough to say something. And because I didn't know if I needed to be concerned. Yeah. And because I had been through this so many times, and they tell you 10 movements an hour, and he was doing 10 movements an hour, but that was not normal for him. Yeah. But that's not the advice that they gave of keeping track of what was normal for your baby. And so they're like, well, we can monitor him if you want. And I was like, oh, it's fine. I'm sure he's fine. He's a 5th, like, it's fine. And they're like, well, my midwife, and I'm so thankful for her, because she said, well, you're obviously concerned enough to where you're going to say something. Yes. So go ahead and monitor him just to make sure he's okay. And so they did. And they did an NST, and
which is a non-stress test. And so it's basically just strapping on a heart monitor and tracking
the heart monitor and the contraction thing. And his heart rate was beautiful. Didn't have any variations that they were concerned about. I had 2 contractions while being monitored, and he tolerated those just fine. The only thing I know now, which I noticed then, but I didn't know it to be concerned, was that he only moved 4 times in the 25 minutes that they monitored him. Okay. And by standards of what they were looking for, that was considered passing. And so, but in reality, he probably should have moved about 40 times.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like he was quite active already. And so for him to just have very low movement.
But because of what they were looking for, nobody was concerned, and we didn't have any concerns. And but I remember being on that NST machine, and I was like, did he kick? Was that a kick? What should I push the button? Questioning if it was really a kick or not. And I try really hard not to go back in those moments and have a lot of guilt with them. And if I wouldn't have pushed the button, then would they have looked further into what was going on? Yeah. But I remember questioning if some of his movements were actual movements, and if those should count as a movement. Yeah. Because they were so soft. And but but he was moving, but not like he normally would. I mean, my whole belly would move when he moved.
Yeah.
You know, it was like a tidal wave going on. And these were just like little blips. And but anyway, they confirmed that he was fine according to the NST measures that they look for, and sent me on my way. And I had not a care in the world.
Yeah.
Called up my husband and was like, oh, he's great, you know. And my 4-year-old came to my 3-year-old came to me to all of my appointments, because he was my little at-home buddy.
Yep.
At school. So we met my husband for lunch, like we did with all of my other visits to the midwives. The only visits he ever came to were the ultrasounds, and that's how I liked it to be. Like, you don't need to be here. He's fine. Baby's fine. It's just, I'm in and out in 30 minutes. Like, don't take off of work for this.
Yeah.
You know? And so we just met up with him for lunch afterwards. And we ate at Arby's and had a roast beef and cheese sandwich. And I know you're not supposed to eat deli meat. That was the only time in my pregnancy I ate deli meat. But even then, like, I go back and question, was it that? And I know it's not. But just it's amazing the details that you remember and the questioning that you do with all of them.
Yeah.
And that was definitely the case with some of the last days now when I think about it. But yeah, we had lunch, we had a great time, went home, got my kids from school, did homework with them, took them to karate class that evening. Everything was great. And got in the bathtub that night. I remember this vividly. I got in the bathtub with a can of Pringles.
Sounds great.
Like, I want some Pringles. Still can't eat Pringles to this day. And he was still moving around, but still very softly.
Yeah.
And went to bed after I got out of the bath and went to sleep. And woke up the next morning, got the kids to school, and ate a bowl of Cheerios, Honey Nut Cheerios. And that seemed to be like my go-to breakfast when I was pregnant, because I'm not at the time, I wasn't a huge breakfast person, but I'm like, I need to eat something for the baby.
Yeah.
So had a bowl of Honey Nut Cheerios, and I remember laying down on my bed with my 3-year-old, and I was contemplating going to the gym that morning, because I hadn't been in a couple of weeks, because there was just some sicknesses going in through our house. My daughter had strep, and I just didn't want to go because I didn't know if I had it or if my 3-year-old had it, and so I just stayed home. But I was gonna go to the gym that morning, and then something in me decided not to, and just to stay home. And I'm very thankful for that. And also, I will say, he was head up until I was about 35 weeks. My only baby, who would not go to head down. He was breeched until I was about 35 weeks.
Okay.
All my other kids were head down by the time they were like 30, 32 weeks, and they never flipped. And they always laid with their backs on my right or my left side and head down, and then feet. They were completely left side. And so my belly was like
always
off.
kind of like,
and, but he would not flip head down. And so I would do a lot of the inversions and headstands, and because at the time I was very active, and that was not out of the norm for me to do workout movements or do things like that. But I was very cautious with those things, and paid attention to what was comfortable for my body at the gestation I was. And I was very mindful of those things.
Yeah. And that's the recommendation right now. I was like, if you were active before, then you continue doing it until you're, So
and it felt good to work out. it felt great to run
Yeah.
with him. And I did a lot of intervals.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't like run like 2 miles, but I walk 2 miles,
Yes.
because that was what was comfortable. But yeah, so he was head up, and I remember doing a lot of inversions, and he finally flipped head down, because I was like, I am not going to have a C-section for my last baby.
You're like, come on. Yeah.
Like, I knew I wasn't going to try to deliver a breech baby, but
Yeah.
I was like, come on, I've delivered 4 babies vaginally, like, flip, child, flip. I just remember being very frustrated with him, like, we need to get on the same page here, and you need to turn head down. And he finally did. And I bring that up for what I'll share later, but so he finally flipped, but yeah, so that morning I did not go to the gym. And I just remember laying on my bed next to my 3-year-old. He was watching a movie, and just being like, have I felt him this morning? Because he was always really active after I ate, within 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been almost an hour by that time, because I ate with the kids before I took them to school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about 9:15 a.m. And I was like, I don't think I felt him yet this morning. And so I just kind of laid there and was pushing on my belly. And anytime I would push him, he would react, and he'd kick me somewhere else, or he'd move out of the way and be like, leave me alone, And he had quite the personality. And he would not respond to anything I was doing. And that was very, very strange for him to not move at all. And I remember getting concerned, and then the panic, because of the stories that I had read.
Yeah.
That being a familiar theme with those stories.
Yeah.
And with him, I bought a Doppler. He was my last baby. I wanted to hear his heartbeat whenever I wanted.
Yeah.
Never did that with my other kids. So I got my Doppler out, and I knew where he was laying. Again, I had done this many times before, so I knew where I should find his heartbeat. And it was just dead silence. And just like that static, like echoing static noise. And I knew in that moment that he was gone. And I don't know why I knew, but I knew. And I was checking all over, even in places I knew his back wasn't in.
Yeah.
And I was checking all over, and I did that for about a minute. Frantically got out of bed, because in my mind, I'm like, I've got to get to the hospital, because they can do a C-section and get him out. Yeah. And got my 3-year-old dressed, and it was such a frantic thing. I just remember flying out of the bed and throwing clothes on my 3-year-old, like just throwing them on, because it was a half-hour drive to the hospital. And hurried and got in the car and just rushing down the highway and calling my husband. And I think about this now, and I'm like, I was so panicked. So many things could have happened. But I just needed to get there, because in my mind, I thought that they could save him. And I remember calling my husband and telling him, I was very frantic. And I was like, I can't find the baby's heartbeat. He's not moving. I'm headed to the hospital. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, I can't find his heartbeat on the Doppler. He's not moving. And I was getting frustrated that he wasn't understanding what I was saying, that our baby was gone. And he's like, Desiree, calm down. Like, do you have Andrew with you? And I'm like, yes, I've got Andrew with me. And I remember it just being like, just meet me at the hospital, please. And flying down the highway. And I don't even remember how fast I was going. I was going pretty fast. And would not recommend that to most people. But at the time, like, I didn't know who else I could even call, and I didn't want to wait.
Yeah.
I knew it was of a concern, but I couldn't find his heartbeat at all. Because again, I knew it, somewhere in my brain knew that he was gone and that I needed to get to the hospital. And I remember calling my midwife's office and telling them again, I'm like, I can't find his heartbeat. I'm headed to the hospital. Should I go to the labor and delivery, or do I need to come to your office? And they're like, well, calm down. I'm sure everything's fine. And I'm like, no. You don't understand. Like, I can't, like, I use my Doppler and I can't find his heartbeat. And they're like, we'll get you there, but just go to labor and delivery. And so they didn't even tell me to come to the office because they could tell I was completely panicked.
Right.
And so I drove right to labor and delivery, and the entire way there, I was pushing on his bottom to try to get him to move. Because I was just praying that I could just feel one kick. And I remember praying the whole way there, just pleading with God to just save my son. And I finally got to the hospital and went in through the emergency room entrance and had to check in. Even though they knew I was coming, I'm like, I just need to go to labor and delivery. And they're like, well, you have to wait because someone has to roll you up. I'm like, no. Like, I need to get up to labor and delivery. And they're like, well, why are you here? And I said, my son's not moving. And I even said my son. And I had no idea he was a boy. But I knew he was a boy. And they're like, okay, well, we'll get someone here to wheel you up. And so I had to wait about 10 minutes for someone to finally come and get a wheelchair and wheel me up. And I remember the elevator doors opening, and after we got up to the labor and delivery floor, and my husband was standing right there because he worked about like 10 minutes away from the hospital. So he got there before I did. And I just lost at that point because I wasn't crying at this point. I was just very panicked, and I just lost it. And he's like, Desiree, oh my gosh. Like, I think he realized in that moment, because again, we've done this how many times, and I've never had that kind of reaction to not like any part of my pregnancy. And the nurses could see how very concerned I was, and they were expecting my arrival because my midwife had apparently called them. And they immediately took me into a room. And our 3-year-old is with us, and she is trying to find the heartbeat with the monitor. And I remember her being like, well, maybe that's it. And I was just like, no, that's not it. That's not it. And I just remember covering my eyes with my hands and just saying, oh my God, over and over and over and over again. And I'm a huge believer in not saying the Lord's name in vain. But in that moment, I was pleading with him for this not to be happening. And I thought maybe if I pleaded enough that we could find a heartbeat. But I don't know how many times I said that over and over and over again. And they were trying so hard to find his heartbeat. And then at some point, I don't know how long, once I entered that labor and delivery floor, the time just gets real confusing. But I know at some point my midwife came in. I could hear her voice. I don't remember if I looked at her. I just remember hearing her voice. And she's like, we'll get an ultrasound, we'll look. And they had an ultrasound machine. And I remember my husband being very quiet through all of it. And my son, from what I know now, was sitting in the corner of the room. And at some point, a nurse had come in and given him some coloring sheets. And I didn't know any of this was going on. And he had colored, I still have it to this day, he had colored this owl completely blue. But that's what he was doing while all of this was going on. And I remember my midwife finally getting the ultrasound machine out again. I don't know how long of a space of time, but it seemed like it was quick and not quick enough all in the same time. And I just remember hearing her say, I don't understand. He was just fine yesterday. And my husband just being like, well, what do you mean? And nobody ever said there's no heartbeat. I'm sorry, because they knew I already knew. And she just said a couple of times, I just don't understand. I don't understand. And they had to have another ultrasound tech come in to confirm that he had passed. And again, I don't remember how long it took, but it was a little while, at least I'd say 15, 20 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
And this whole time I just had my eyes covered because I knew what I would see. I would see my baby still on the screen. And I knew I did not want that image imprinted in my head of my child. And so the ultrasound tech came in, and I just remember hearing her, never saw her face, because I had my eyes covered this entire time and just screaming and crying. And I just remember hearing her say, is that all you needed? And, basically confirming that indeed he had died. And I remember the nurse who was trying to find his heartbeat. I'm really good friends with her to this day. She prayed over us and prayed with us right after we had found out. And at some point immediately after that, the nurse said to my husband in some capacity of, well, what would you like to do, but like kind of explain like what was going to happen, and asked him if he wanted to make some phone calls. And he said, well, should I be making phone calls? Like even then, like he couldn't comprehend that our son had died, because he was, these kind of things don't happen.
They don't happen.
Right? Yeah. And so, and she just said, yes, you need to make some phone calls. And they explained that I could either go home and collect some things and come back that evening, or I could be induced, or we could do a C-section. And my husband was like totally taken back, because he's like, wait, what do you, like, we still have to give birth? Like, my wife still has to go through this? And in my mind, I knew I was going to have to still go through it, because there's only one way a baby comes out, it's C-section or birth. Both are births. Sorry, you're going to have to give birth one way or another. And I just remember looking at the nurses and being like, there's no way I can go home. There's no way. Like, that's where all of his things were. That's where my kids were going to be home. Like, how am I going to face my children? Like, there was absolutely no way in my mind I would be able to go into my home and then come back. I couldn't comprehend how I could even do that.
Yeah.
Because I knew if I went home, in my mind, I didn't want to go back, because I knew eventually I'd have to give birth and give away my child. And so I immediately was like, no, like I'm staying, like I'm not going home. And at some point, again, this is like my husband was making these phone calls. I was not aware of all of this going on. But he had stepped outside of the room to make the phone calls. And at some point, his family had arrived, his mom and his brother and our sister-in-law, his brother's wife. And again, because we lived 9 houses down from them. and we had Andrew, and somebody had to come and get Andrew. So they came in at some point. I don't remember how long of a time went on from when we found out until they arrived. But I know at some point they had come. And I remember Andrew coming up to my side of the bed and him just grabbing my face right before they took him home. And he just said, "Mommy, everything will be okay. Everything will be okay. Don't cry, Mommy." And in that moment, it was so sweet and so heartbreaking because he had no idea why I was crying, and he had no idea in his 3-year-old mind the impact that this moment had on our family. But just being so sweet and innocent. And I cherish that so much. And that's just his little personality. Like, he's just so sweet and always very concerned about his mom. And he was definitely in that moment. And so his family had come in and everybody was a mess. And very little words were spoken, but just complete heartbreak. You could tell everybody was just heartbroken. And I remember them taking Andrew, and we asked them if they could pick up our kids from school, because by the time we found out that he was dead was about 10 o'clock in the morning. So it was about an hour. Like, all of this probably happened within an hour, like between when I got concerned and it was confirmed.
Wow. Okay.
But when they arrived, I'm assuming it was closer to like noon, like 11 or 12 o'clock-ish. And I remember asking I didn't ask because I was a mess, but my husband asked if they could pick up our kids from school, because we didn't want them to be concerned. In that moment, you just have no idea how to react or what to do. And so we knew that the best place for them to be was with family. But we asked them not to tell them because we didn't want them to have to break the news to our kids and then us not be there, because they were old enough to understand.
Yeah.
Our oldest was 11 at the time, and she was 11, and then our second oldest was 9, and then the next oldest was 6. She was almost 7, and then Andrew at 3. And so the older 3 had enough capacity to understand what death meant, and we didn't want our family to have to tell them that. At some point, we were just by ourselves in that room, in the triage room. And Andrew and his family had left. My husband's family had left. And we were just kind of waiting. And I just remember just like the sorrow that we just both felt, and just being absolutely devastated, and just not really speaking, but more of our souls connecting on just this deep level of grief. And my husband being absolutely crushed, knowing that what I was going to have to endure still, and not being able to do anything about it. And I remember apologizing to him over and over and over again that I couldn't keep our baby safe. And I think about that now, and I'm like, I did everything I could to keep him safe, but in that moment, I failed my son. And I know better now, 5 years later, but in that moment, I failed him. And I remember apologizing to him over and over and over again. And my husband just being like, "You have nothing to apologize for." And so they eventually brought us back to a labor and delivery room. And we were away from everybody else. But in order to get there, we had to pass by all of the rooms with laboring moms, and all the heartbeats and all the noises. But once we finally got to our room, I knew there was nobody else around us. And they had I believe it was a yellow rose. They had something on the door. And to signify that, that this is not a room that's like all the other rooms that are here, and that this baby is gone or will be gone shortly after birth. I knew that enough I was like, well, why do they have, and then I was like, oh,
Yeah.
So I'm like, they didn't have that on any of my other doors.
Yep.
And just realizing, oh, that's what that's for. And so they got us in our room, and they did not hook me up to any type of monitors at all. And
not even a contraction monitor or anything?
No. And I knew they weren't going to do the heartbeat monitor because there was no reason to monitor him. But I was really surprised that they didn't have a contraction monitor on me. But I didn't think in the moment to say anything, because I was like, oh, must be how they deal with these things. And so I remember like questioning that, but not having enough capacity to ask a question about why, or if that was normal. But everybody that we dealt with at the hospital was just wonderful. They made the worst situation the best it could be for our family, and I'm very grateful for that. But I remember thinking how weird that was, that I wasn't even being monitored with the contractions, because I was being induced and I had Pitocin, and that was the first time I ever was induced with any of my kids.
Okay.
All my other kids were born right on their due date at 40. And so I was expecting the same for Turner. Well, I take that back. Our fourth was not. He was 41 weeks in one day. But the other three followed the due date trend. So I knew I was close to delivering, but I still had 2 more weeks to go.
Yeah. And you didn't have any contractions. You weren't, you had those 2, like when you were doing your AST, but you weren't feeling any pain or nothing so far.
No.
Okay.
No, I was not in labor at this point when they checked us in or any of it.
Yeah.
My cervix was dilated a little bit, but it was all my other, and they still stayed in until 40 weeks. But yeah, so they did that. And at some point, our bishop, who is like a pastor in our church, came. He and his wife did, and they sat with us for a little while. And I just remember those moments while we were waiting for labor to start and for everything to like kick in, just being very dark and just unlike anything I had had with my other babies. And but I told the nurses, I'm like, because they asked me if I wanted any pain medication, like what I wanted. And I said, no, I'm going to do everything like I had planned. Like nothing is going to change about what I want and to bring him into the world. I know he's gone, but I don't want to change anything about how I bring him into the world. And with all the other kids, I had waited until I couldn't wait anymore and was in so much pain that I was like, please give me the epidural. Because I have traditionally, like I had very long labors with my other children.
Yeah.
And so I was expecting this to be a very long process. My girls were about a day and a half of like just very long beginning labor and then very short
actual pushing.
Yeah. labor. And so they had the Pitocin hooked up, but I was able to walk around and move around. And I remember getting on the birthing ball. We had a doula. That was the first time that I wanted a doula.
Yeah.
And they didn't have that available for the other kids, but this hospital had doulas available for any mom that wanted them. And so I was like, yeah, that sounds great, because that was what I wanted to do with him originally. And I remember the doula coming in, and She was this very young girl, and just thinking, oh my gosh, she's so young and she's going to have to somehow help me through this. Because at the time I was 35.
Yeah.
35. And then I found out it was her first labor by herself.
Oh.
And just feeling horrible for her and me all at the same time, trying to support each other, but having no idea what either of us are doing. And because I was familiar with the labor process, but I didn't know how on earth I was going to give birth to a baby that wouldn't cry and that wouldn't be alive. And so she was very helpful, but you could tell she just did not know what to do. And I'm very thankful she was there. And I ended up seeing her a year later and we talked. So, and I remember apologizing to her, but she was very helpful in the moment of doing the best she could to help support our family.
Yeah.
And during all of this, my husband actually ended up getting sick.
Oh.
And I don't know if it was because of nerves or anxiety, but he ended up getting really sick and ended up passing out like on the couch because of how sick he was. And
wow.
Like upset stomach, vomiting, and migraines. And I was just, it was just like chaos.
Yeah.
And just feeling so bad that like here I am in pain and that my husband's in pain physically from being sick and probably due to the situation and not because he was actually sick. And but feeling absolutely helpless, knowing that either of us couldn't help one another. And but we were able to help each other the best we could. And it seemed like whenever I was really feeling these deep emotions, he was able to support me still, despite what he was also feeling as well. And but we did have a good visit with, as good as you can get, with our bishop and his wife. And I remember them, giving me a blessing and just praying with us. And I think they stayed for about an hour. But other than that, those are the only people who came to our hospital, and not because nobody wanted to, but because we hadn't told anyone what was going on besides our families. And my parents at the time lived in Wisconsin. Well, they still live there.
Yeah.
And I was not near my husband when he called them, but he told me later that when he made the phone call, he told my mom that the baby had died. And my mom just being like, Dave, this isn't funny, because my husband's a very sarcastic.
Oh.
And he's like, no, like the baby died. And they immediately hopped on a plane, but they didn't get there until the next day, which we'll get into. But yeah, so it was just a lot of waiting and just a lot of just emotional and mental anguish. And the physical part of the labor wasn't bad. And I think it's probably because of how many times I've done it. But he was the shortest labor I had had. And I'm not sure if it was because of Tosin or what. It probably had to do with that. But I remember at some point in the night after labor had started and things were progressing, and my husband was sick on the couch, and I was just totally me all by myself, and the lights being really dark. The doula came in and she's like, do you need anything? And I just remember telling her, you don't have to stay. Like, you can just go home. And she's like, no, I'm going to stay. And I'm so glad that she did, because she could tell that I needed her, but I didn't know what to do. And I just felt bad. I think about that now, like, why did I feel bad for her? Like, she was doing everything she could, and you could tell she was just so supportive and just very sweet. But but I just didn't want to add any pain to anyone else because I already felt so horrible and I didn't want anyone else to feel the way I did. And that's like the thoughts I had at that time. And after she had left the room, I just remember just this overwhelming presence of just feeling my son, like his spirit. And I remember like having a conversation with him in my mind, but not talking to anyone. But I remember having this conversation with him in my mind, and just telling him how much I loved him and telling him how much I was sorry. And I remember him telling me that it was okay, and that he was okay. And it was this long experience, but probably maybe like a half-hour thing, but probably was more like 10 seconds. But it felt like a long time, but I know in reality it probably wasn't. And it was probably more like 10, 15 seconds worth. But I remember how special that was for me. And I carry that with me, like, and that helps me get through like my tough days. But that kind of happened like throughout the day as well. Like my husband and I, because we were totally alone, besides the nurses coming in and out. And like after our bishop had left, like we were totally and utterly alone. And we would both look at each other and we both would just be like, do you feel that? Like we could feel there was somebody there with us, or multiple people. And it would come and go. And I've never had that happen. And I know it was my son. I'm not sure who else there was, but I know it was my son. My husband, his dad passed away when he was 19. And so maybe his dad was there, but there were other people in the room with us, even though we couldn't see them.
Yeah.
And so I hold dear to those moments too, as well. But that I just remember that being very profound, to the point where both my husband and I would look at each other and just be like, do you feel that? And then it would just slowly go away. And that happened about like 2 or 3 times in the 10 hours while I was in labor with him. And heaven was very close. I'll just put it that way. For us, that's how it felt. Heaven was very close. And so throughout the night, that just we were again very alone. And just him and I. And at some point, I remember my husband left to go get something out of the vending machine, because he had not eaten anything since lunch. Yeah. Or, well, no, he hadn't eaten anything at all that day besides breakfast, because by the time he got to the hospital, it was around 9:30, 9:45 in the morning. And so he finally went and got something out of the vending machine, and it was in the wee hours of the morning. And I remember the nurse coming in. I had a new nurse at this point. They changed shifts. And I'm still good friends with her to this day. I actually just went to lunch with her a couple days ago. And I just remember telling her, I said, I think he's coming. And again, I'm using he, like my son, like these things, even though I didn't know he was a boy, like confirming that he was a boy. I just remember telling her, I think he's coming. And she looked and she's like, yeah, you're ready to push. And she's like, I need to go find your husband. And so somebody went and found him, and he came back in, and they didn't tell him that I was ready to push. And he's like, is everything okay? I said, he's coming. He's ready to come. And so he came, and he was on my left side, and it was the midwife and a nurse, from what I can remember. It was probably another person there. But I remember just her telling me, push, and I pushed twice and he came out. Before all this, they were asking us, like, what do you want to do after he was born?
Yeah.
And I told him, I said, he's immediately coming on my chest. Like, I'm not doing anything different. I'm literally not doing anything different. Like, he's still my baby. And they immediately placed him on my chest. I know at some point they asked my husband if he wanted to cut the cord, and he hasn't cut the cord with any of our kids except for our oldest. This is not something he enjoys doing, and I don't care if he does or not.
Yeah.
And he was just like, no.
Yeah.
And, they didn't push the issue, obviously. But I remember just when they placed him on my chest, I didn't cry. I was just overjoyed with just how beautiful he was. And I remember looking at him and just being like, honey, look at him. He's so beautiful. He's so beautiful. And I'm like, he's just perfect. And my husband just had his head down on my shoulder and he wasn't looking. And when he finally did, he just sobbed. Because he was just so beautiful. And it just looked like he was sleeping. And I fully expected him to just start breathing. Like, that's how perfect he was. Like, literally nothing wrong. I remember my midwife saying at some point that it was a cord accident, and it was wrapped tightly around his left arm. Oh. And in the crease of his elbow, and his arm was just pinned up to his body with the cord, like, in between his elbow.
Yeah.
Wrapped around his arm and then, like, around his back, to the point where he was born with his hand up by his face because of how pinned he was. And so she was pretty confident, and that was the reason why he had passed, is because it was being compressed in the nook of his elbow. And so, yeah, so that's, there was just no rhyme or reason to it. And I just remember thinking how on earth that was even possible. And just being absolutely just dumbfounded, but absolutely just being dumbfounded by, like, it just being an accident.
Yeah.
And just trying to wrap my head around that, and I couldn't. And I remember, like, because he was on my chest and he had his head over on my left arm, and, like, my breathing was making it look like he was breathing, and I thought in my mind for a second, like, oh, he's alive. And then I realized that it was me. And nobody prepared us for, like, what, like, his skin and how delicate he would be.
Yeah.
But I knew, because of the stories I had read, that he might have peeling skin.
Yeah.
And that his lips would be red. But again, nobody had told me because of the stories I had read while I was pregnant with him. And this is, like, coming back to those, was God preparing me for this, and to know these things. And so and I think back about it now, I wish somebody would have said something about how delicate their skull would be. So I think that took us both back, just how fragile his skull would be. And that was by far, I think, for me, the hardest part of seeing him, was just seeing, it was just like another confirmation that he wasn't alive. Yeah. And it was very difficult, because even though he was beautiful and perfect, it was just like another harsh reality of the situation. And but but he didn't have a lot of like skin slippage. He had a little spot on his shoulder, and he had like a tiny little bubble on his eye, but that hadn't healed or anything, but that was it. And at some point they took him to weigh him, and he was 6 pounds 2 ounces. He was just perfect. And he was 19 and a half inches long, and he just had this dirty blonde hair. And our third child, she was dirty blonde when she was born, but all of our other kids had dark hair. And so, and I remember thinking during my pregnancy, oh, I hope he has dirty blonde hair like Scout, so that she won't feel so left out. And he did. And I was so thankful for that there was a connection there with her in particular. Yeah. I think she kind of cherishes that too as well.
Yeah.
Now. But I just remember in that moment being so glad that he had dirty blonde hair. And he had huge hands, and feet were 3 inches long. All of our boys had big feet and big hands, and he had these tiny little chicken legs, and just like our oldest daughter. So it was like this perfect like little combination of each of these our kids, and we could see that in him. And it was beautiful and heartbreaking all at the same time, being able to see all of that and know that we couldn't bring him home. And I remember at some point they asked us, and this is while I was in labor. I'm kind of like jumping back and forth. There's bits and pieces that I don't remember until like I actually start talking about it.
Yeah.
But they had asked us while we were in labor if we wanted anyone to come after he was born. And I was like, well, our kids are coming. Like they're going to come and meet their brother. And I remember them like almost thinking that we were like, oh, I don't know if you want to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they were almost like questioning if we really wanted to do that. And I was like, yes. It's like in my mind, there was not a question of if they should meet him. And I think if we had only had one young child, I may have questioned it. But because our kids were old enough to understand death, and that they were very much ready to have this new little person in our family, and we're old enough of remembering all of my pregnancy and this time period, I knew in my mind that I didn't want them to know him only through pictures. Yeah. And so we were like, yes, they're coming to the hospital. And also while I was in labor, you know, they were telling us like, well, what do you want to do with funeral and bury, like, and I was like, what?
It's the worst. It's the worst.
And I remember my husband just being like, we haven't even given birth to our baby. How are we supposed to make these decisions? And us asking, well, do you know any funeral homes that we could call? Because we had no idea. And what cemetery do you want him to be buried at? Because we had chosen burial. And we're like, I have no idea. Like, is there a cemetery anywhere near? Yeah. These are not things I paid attention to.
Not at all.
I certainly was not going to pay attention to them during my pregnancy when I was fully thinking the child was going to come home.
Yeah.
So
now, Desiree, can I back up one question? I actually do want to know this. When did you guys get confirmation that Turner was going to be a boy?
Oh, yeah. I totally skipped over that.
No. I want to make sure, because I was like, you kept referring, and I was like, oh, did they already talk about this and figure this out already?
Yeah, because in my mind, it wasn't a surprise. Like,
that's what I was like, oh, she knows. But then I was like, but when did your husband know?
So it was right after he was born. And I remember them placing him on my chest, and I looked and I said, it's a boy. I knew it. It's a boy. And at that point, like, I think my husband was already looking at him. And when I confirmed that it was a boy, he lost it even more. And so just confirming everything I already knew. And so, but yeah, we did find out pretty quickly after he was born while he was on my chest. And I did not look him over. In those moments with him after he was born, I was so in shock. I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know what to do. I knew I wanted to hold him and that I didn't want him to not be held, but I didn't know I could actually look him over and unwrap him and bathe him and do all the things I would do with my children normally. And that's one aspect I wish somebody would have guided us through a little bit more. And again, the nurses did the best they could. Like we were treated very well while we were there. And but I wish I would have known that I could have done those things.
Yeah.
Because they did give him a bath, but they took him over to the warmer and did that about an hour after he was born, before our kids arrived. And so neither one of us gave him a bath, but the nurses did. And they got him dressed, and because again, we didn't have anything with us.
Yeah.
And the hospital, I think it's called Years Foundation or something, or some organization had donated a bunch of different types of outfits.
Oh, okay.
And so they dressed him in a little, like a blue gown that had like crocheted neck and it tied in the back. But then they had him wrapped in like a crocheted blanket, and I never took him out of that. I have pictures of his chest and I have pictures of his legs, but I only know that they look like that because of those pictures.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. Because I have the same thing where I didn't know that I could look him over, like my son over. And
yeah. And like, I think about that now and I'm like, you were his mother. Of course you could do those things. But in those moments, I had no idea.
Yeah.
That exactly I could right. And that I should.
Yeah.
Because I did want to see him, but I just didn't know the things I could do, and that it's perfectly okay to do those things. I remember them bringing him back to me after he had his bath, and he was born at 5:02 in the morning. So we found out around 10 o'clock in the morning on March 24th.
Right. Okay.
And then he was born the next morning at 5:02 a.m. So it wasn't quite 24 hours from the time that we found out until he was actually born.
Yeah.
They had brought him back to me because we immediately, like when he was born, my husband told his family, because we knew enough that our kids needed to see him right away, and that we shouldn't wait for them to see him, because we knew enough about, just the natural process of death. And so it was very imperative that we made sure that our family, my parents and his parents and brother, knew that he was born. And so, so they came to the hospital around 7:30 that morning. And again, our children did not know that he was gone. And so they kind of figured out that I was at the hospital and in labor, because they asked my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, like, well, what is mom at the hospital having the baby? And they're like, yeah, she's having the baby, and they didn't lie, but we asked them specifically not to tell them what was going on. And I don't have any regrets about that, because I didn't want that burden to be on somebody else. Yeah. And for our family then to have to comfort and console our children while we weren't there. And we wanted that morning of them knowing and finding out to come from us as their parents. So my husband, his brother had called him and let him know that they were there, and my husband met them out in the lobby, in the labor and delivery lobby. I didn't see any of this, but the kids were very excited, and just like, did mom have the baby? And my husband's like, yeah, she had the baby. And my husband said that they then asked if it was a boy. And he said, yes, he's a boy. And they said, well, can we go see her? Can we go see her and the baby? And he said, yes, you can, but I need to tell you something first. And my husband said that he told them that the baby had died. And he said that our oldest just fell to her knees and just was screaming. And our son was just in complete, like, just shock. And Scout and Andrew started crying as well. Again, they're in the labor and delivery lobby, and there's other families there that are waiting. And, you know, so they saw that happen as well. I don't know how long they were out there, but they eventually came in. And I remember having enough, like, mental state to know I had to pull myself together, because I'm like, I can't make this any more harder on them for them to see me a complete mess. And even though I was an absolute wreck. And I remember braiding my hair at some point. I don't know if it was after they came in or not, but I remember, like, getting myself ready for this moment with my children. And the nurses made sure that I was holding him. They didn't want him to not be in my arms when the kids came in. And they all came in, and I just remember them all crying except for my oldest son. He was just like a ghost, like just white, just in pure shock. And my oldest daughter was just a mess, and was very terrified to look at him, because she didn't know. She told me later that she didn't know what he would look like, and she was scared that he would look different. And I remember Andrew just being so excited still, even though everybody was crying. And Scout and Andrew had no problem coming over and looking at him. And I remember Scout crawled up on my bed, and Andrew was, I have pictures of this, and I think I shared them as well, of Andrew being on one side and Scout in front of me, and I'm trying to console Scout while Andrew is just loving on his brother. And just like, look at the baby, look at his eyes, mommy, look at his mouth, look at his nose. And he was just in so much awe of his brother. And I remember just so many conflicting emotions in that moment of Andrew being so in love with this baby, his brother, and so proud. And then I'm trying to console my daughter. And because she's just like, why, mommy? You know, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't have the answers. And I'm like, but he's beautiful and perfect. And I just wanted them to know that it was okay for them to love on him, for them to, if they wanted to hold him, they could. And if they wanted to give him a kiss, they could, and all these things. And I remember at some point looking over at my son, and he was kind of standing over in the distance. And I remember telling him, because I could tell he just was not knowing what to do. He was 9 and or 8. He was 8 or 9. But he just didn't know what to do. And I remember looking at him and just saying, Thomas, it's okay to cry. And he just lost it. And it broke my heart even more because I'm like, here he is trying to think that he has to be strong. And, like just finding out that his brother had died and here he is trying to be strong. And I'm sure it was also shock as well. But I remember he finally just cried and cried. And then my other daughter was standing by my side, and I remember telling her, so I've got like all these little people I'm trying to manage and all the different emotions they have. But I remember looking at Reagan specifically, and she was on my right side while Andrew and Scout are over here. And I remember looking at her and I said, you're more than welcome to hold him if you want. She's like, I can't. And I said, that's fine. That's fine if you don't want to hold him. And I could tell she wasn't looking at him. And I know my daughter well enough to know, like, she's looking at him because she's scared.
Yeah.
And I remember telling her, he's absolutely perfect. There's nothing wrong with him. And I said, he just looks like he's sleeping. And I said, but if you want to look at him, you need to look now. And I said, because you're never going to get this moment again. And those were some of the hardest words I've ever had to tell my child, and she wouldn't ever be able to see her brother again. And if she wanted to see him, she needed to do it now. And so she finally looked at him and she was just like, he's beautiful. And I'm like, I know. And her just asking over and over, just like, Scott, why? And I just had no answers. I had no answers for them. And those moments when all of our kids were in the same room were some of the most soul-crushing, but yet beautiful moments. Because it was the only time I've ever had all of those 5 children together in one room with him outside of my body, obviously. Yeah. And so we did tell them at some point during my labor, they had asked if I wanted now I lay me down to sleep to come in. And and I knew about this organization again because of the stories I had read. And so they didn't have to explain it to me. And I said, yes, definitely, yes, we want them to come in. And so they came in at some point while our kids were there. So we have pictures of all of our family together. And they took some beautiful pictures. And the nurses also took some beautiful pictures for us too. We have so many pictures of him. And I'm just so grateful for that. Again, like, it's just so many like tender mercies that we had, like whether throughout my pregnancy of all the pictures and videos I took of him. Because had it been any of our other children, I would have never have had any of that during their pregnancy. So just those little tender mercies now that I see. And so they came in and did all that. And I don't remember how long our kids stayed, but it wasn't for too long. And Dave's family also came in with them as well. Okay. My husband's name is Dave. I don't think I even mentioned that either.
You mentioned it. It's fine.
Oh, my husband, you're supposed to know his name. But so his mother and his brother and his brother's wife came in. His mother and my sister-in-law both held him. And his brother just couldn't. And I totally was okay with that. I wanted everyone to do what they were comfortable doing. But I knew I definitely wanted everyone to meet him. Yeah. And I didn't want anyone to feel forced like they had to hold him or had to do certain things with him. And so after everyone left, again, we were left completely alone. And at some point, probably about like closer to lunchtime now, around like noonish, they transferred us to another room. And They took us to what I know now to be the surgical floor,
Oh,
like
okay.
post-surgery floor.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that because I wasn't in the same area as the other moms with their babies.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear any other babies crying. And I'm so glad that they have that set up, that you're not on the same floor room area as all the other babies, because I don't think I would have handled that very well.
Mm-hmm.
So they took us up there, and I held him in my arms the entire route of being wheelchaired there. And I remember telling the nurse who was wheeling us, I was very firm on that I'm not covering up my child and I don't care who sees him. And because I wasn't sure if they were going to tell me I needed to do that, because they said they could wheel him in a bassinet. And I said, no, he's not leaving my arms. And the hospital did not have a cuddle cot at this time. But we also didn't know what they were.
Right. Yeah.
Another thing I wish somebody would have advised us of was to not keep him bundled up so tightly. And we also did not turn the temperature I just wish somebody would have told us to try to keep him cold, because my mothering instincts with my babies and just is to keep them next to me and to keep them warm. And I was starting to feel him turn cold, and I didn't want him to turn cold.
Right.
And because in my mind, I'm like, I need to keep him warm and I need to keep him safe. And had somebody said that, like, well, actually what's best for him, if you want to keep him longer, is to keep him cold. I would have done that immediately, but I didn't know. So they took us up to another room. My parents came shortly thereafter, like about a half hour probably after we got transferred to this room. And I remember my parents coming in, and so my mom didn't know what to do to help, but and my husband told me later that when he called them, my mom immediately, like, okay, I'll be there. Like, there was to come. But he told me later that he ended up coming because he knew my husband would need to have just as much support. And so they both came, and I'm so glad. And I know that he wasn't like questioning whether or not he should come, because it wasn't a sad situation, or he didn't want to be there. But I think he just wanted my mom to comfort me. But then once he realized that my husband also needed that same comfort, he was like, well, yeah, I need to come too.
Yeah. That was smart. I'm so glad that they were able to come, because that it makes a huge difference. Like, because dads are totally forgotten, I think.
Yeah. Yes. So, but I was just amazed how quickly they were able to book a flight and get there. Mm-hmm. Because from the time we found out until he was born, it was maybe 20 hours. And so I'm just so thankful. And they live like in a small town. They don't live like near a huge airport. And so I'm just so thankful they were able to fly across the country, essentially, to come and be with us, and to get there in time to actually meet him. And so by the time we got to that room, it was around 12:30, and I don't remember a lot of what was said, but I just remember them holding him, and just just us trying to take advantage of the moments that we knew we had left. And I will say, like, when I found out that he had passed, I knew immediately that I was going to have to give him away. And I remember immediately saying in that moment, during my sobbing and everything, looking at my husband and just saying, how am I ever going to give him away? And I wanted to spend just one night with him. And the nurse, the supervisor nurse, ended up telling us, he was like, well, I don't think you're going to be prepared for what he's going to look like in the morning. And I remember that being very harsh. He was the only one I really had a problem with.
Oh,
He seemed very upset that we weren't off the labor and delivery floor quicker. And he wanted Turner out of the labor and delivery. He made it pretty apparent. And my nurses and my midwife, I remember them being like, no, they're staying here. Like however long they need to stay on labor and delivery floor before we transfer them, they're going to stay here. But I remember there being like this fight about him wanting us off that floor.
Yeah.
And so that was like the only negative aspect of the care that we received. But they were also able to get a lock of his hair and his feet prints and his hand prints. And they were able to get a mold of his foot, like impression, not his whole foot, but like his little foot impression.
Yeah.
And they put that in a seashell. And they also gave us a blue teddy bear for us to take home. And so I remember telling that.
I was going to ask, did that hospital have a policy on how long you could keep Turner?
No, they did not.
Okay.
What I know. Okay. And that policy is still in place today.
Okay.
And we can,
yeah, we can talk about that.
we'll get there. But yeah, so they told us we could, that's why I was pretty adamant on wanting that one night with him.
Okay. So you were able to, so you were like, we're going to stay the night. They don't have any restrictions. That's great.
Yeah.
That's super great.
Because I just wanted one. I knew I wasn't going to get any nights with him in my arms.
No.
And I just wanted one night to be able to sleep next to my baby, because this whole time I hadn't slept.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to take advantage of every moment that I got with him, whether I was still pregnant with him in labor or after he was born. But I remember thinking very vividly, these are the only memories or moments I'm going to get with him, and you can't fall asleep.
Yeah.
So, and I did get an epidural at some point as well.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
But I remember that nurse saying, I don't think you're going to be prepared for what he's going to look like in the morning. And I just remember being like, well, I don't care what he's going to look like in the morning. And my dad, I remember him looking at me and being like, Desiree, you're not doing what's best for him. And I remember in that moment just being like, yeah, like I need to start thinking about my son and what's best for him. And just like, that parenting aspect finally kicking in of I'm doing everything I want to do for me, but I'm not taking into consideration for maybe what's best for him and his body at this point. And so I was like, okay. And at this point my husband had called the funeral homes, and while I was in labor, and I remember hearing the haggling going on of prices and just realizing like, what is my life right now? I haven't even given birth. Like, so all of this had already taken place. And they told us to call them when we were ready to give him away. And, but I remember in those moments while I was still in labor, just thinking this has got to be just a horrible nightmare. Like, what is this? And my husband's over here calling funeral homes for a baby I haven't even given birth to. And we're being forced to make these decisions we don't want to make, nor do we have the mental capacity to try to make them. But we did find a funeral home who was very loving and they had a lot of compassion for us. And so we told the nurse that we were ready for the funeral home to come and get him. And it was about 12 and a half hours total is what we were able to spend with him. after he was born. And at this point, he was starting to look just tired.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can describe it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't ready to let him go, but I knew he was. He had been through so much already. And I remember telling the nurse, like, you know, okay, go ahead and call the funeral home. And I said, but you have to get my discharge papers. Like, I have to be discharged before I let him go because I can't stay here anymore. And like, I can't stay in here without my baby. And she's like, okay. And so they got all of that ready before the funeral home was called. And then I remember that wait, because the funeral home we chose was even further than where we lived.
Oh.
And so there was this weight of knowing that they were on their way.
Yeah.
And it was I believe it was a Saturday. No, it was a Friday when he was born. And at this point, it was like rush hour as well in Columbia. So it just felt like forever knowing that I was going to have to say goodbye to my son and knowing that I was going to have to give him over. And just remember feeling like this is the longest wait of my life. Just knowing what was to come. And so the nurse eventually came in and told us that they were there. And I remember and she said, would you like to walk him down or do you want me to take him? And I remember asking her, I said, am I going to have to see them put his body into a body bag? And I don't know what made me say that, but I said it. And she just said, why don't you let him come with me? And so I knew in that moment, like, that's what she was saying, like, yes, you will have to see that. And so I'm glad I asked because I would not have been able to witness that.
No.
And so I remember apologizing to him so many times. Just apologizing to him over and over again, just telling him how sorry I was and how much I loved him. And just saying over and over again, I love you so much. And I finally gave him to the nurse. And she turned around and just said, I'll take good care of him. And she left. And when she left the room, I just remember falling to my knees and just screaming. That was probably the hardest thing that I had to do in any of this. For me, that was harder than even having to give birth to him or anything. Just physically relinquishing your child's body to somebody else and knowing that you were never going to see them or hold them or do anything. And I knew we would see him at his funeral, but I didn't know if I'd ever hold him again. And I knew that was more than likely going to be the last time I ever held him. And so I just remember falling to my knees and just this coming from me and just feeling completely broken all over again. And my parents coming and gathering me up off the floor. And my husband trying to steady my feet underneath me. And I just remember telling them, I have to get out of here. I have to get out of here. And so we finally gathered up our things, and it didn't take very long for anyone to come with a wheelchair to wheel me out again. It was like those waiting periods where they were so awful. And having this little box that they gave us, I'm so thankful for that box, but just being so mad that all I had was this box instead of my baby on my lap. And I remember leaving the hospital just being so mad, so mad and so sad and all of the things, but just mad, just very mad that this was happening. And they took us down a back way so we didn't have to go through any elevators with anybody else. It was like what the nurses and doctors use the elevators, those elevators, and came out the same doors that I entered in, and just trying to comprehend how just 24 hours ago, like a little over 24 hours ago, like I was coming in here with a baby and now I'm leaving without one. And the whole car ride home, I remember just looking into other people's cars and seeing them laughing and talking and all these things. And I'm like, how are you able to do that? Like my whole world has just been crushed, and you're laughing and just trying to make like any kind of sense of how the world is even still moving and operating, and how anyone could possibly not be feeling exactly what I was. And we got home, and I don't think our children were there. Like after I left the hospital, it all becomes really fuzzy those first few days. But I remember, I think I went to my room and just like staying there for a long time. And so that was like the whole hospital and coming home. I don't remember much about those early days.
You're just in so much shock. I mean, like, how can you not be?
But I remember my parents stayed with us for a few days until his funeral. And my dad had to go back to work. He's a dentist, and so he had to go back to work, so he was not able to stay for the funeral. But my mom was there for about a week until she went back. And but yeah, just a lot of emptiness and just not even knowing how to operate or do anything. And knowing I still have these 4 children I still have to tend to. And also deal with their grief on top of it.
Yeah.
And also making funeral arrangements.
Yes.
And just being completely overwhelmed.
Yeah. How can you not be? Like, oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so
sorry. It's like a whirlwind in my mind.
Yeah.
Like those days afterwards, I remember the details of planning his funeral, but nothing else.
Yeah.
It's like I couldn't even tell you if I got out of bed. I have no idea. I know I did at some point.
Yeah.
But just so much shock and just such deep and profound sorrow and grief. Because he was the first loved one that I've had who had passed away.
Yeah.
That was really close to me. I had grandparents pass away, but I never really knew them very well because they lived so far away.
Yeah.
That was the first profound loss that I've ever walked through. And even my husband walking through his dad's death, like we were both just completely incapacitated.
Yeah.
So
this is such a different type of loss, and it's hard to it's hard to grasp it all. And so yes, like it rocks your world regardless of what you've been through. Desiree, so you were planning the funeral. Mm-hmm. And tell me how that went. How were the plans, and then tell me about the funeral.
I remember going there the day after we got home. And I don't remember saying a lot. My husband kind of took care of it, but I remember meeting with the funeral director and having to pick out a casket and just having to make all of those decisions, and just thinking how horrible it was that they had caskets set small.
Yeah.
And that I had to pick one out.
Yeah.
And just it felt like such an out of body experience. And like I remember enough that morning when I woke up fully expecting that I'd wake up out of this dream and everything would be fine. And then the realization, no, I have to go to the funeral home. And so while we were there, I remember my husband asking the funeral director if our son was there, because they had 2 or 3 different locations. This funeral home, they were like a very well-known funeral home in the area.
Okay.
And the funeral I remember him saying, yes, he's here. And we both sobbed. And I remember wanting to ask if we could see him, but I also knew at the same time I wouldn't be able to leave him again. And that I was only able to do that one more time at his actual funeral. And so I remember wanting to say it, but not saying it because I knew what that would mean also.
Yeah.
So we picked out his casket and made all the arrangements, and they were very, very accommodating. They only charged us what the casket was actually like, the actual charge for it. They didn't upcharge anything.
Yeah.
They didn't charge us for the use of their building or the awning or the chairs or opening and closing the grave. I remember them being very compassionate and just being so grateful for that, that they were very understanding of our situation. And I remember having to choose like a cemetery. We didn't choose that until after we left. And I remember visiting a cemetery that was about 30 minutes away that day as well. We went there right after the funeral home, and it's where a lot of members of our church from that congregation are buried. And there was a lady in our congregation whose son is buried there, and he died when he was 5.
Oh.
I remember her saying that he was buried there. And so I was like, well, maybe we should have him buried there. Like that's where Tanya's son is buried.
Yeah.
And we went there, and I just remember it not feeling right. I remember it feeling like it was too far away, and it just didn't feel right for him. And I didn't want it to be like a trek going to the cemetery.
Yeah.
And that I wanted to be able to go to the cemetery where he was anytime. Mm-hmm. I didn't want it to be long, like far away. And so we ended up finding out that there was another cemetery at a Pentecostal church that was only like 2.5 miles from our home.
Oh, yeah.
And we went there. We met with their board that's over the cemetery or services, whatever. But there was several people we had to meet with.
Oh.
And they asked us, about our son, about what happened. And they were just like, you are more than welcome to bury your son here. Like, we won't even charge you for the plot. Like, this is horrible, And just the compassion, again, that they had on us, and just how much that helped us in that moment, because we were just completely incapable of knowing what to do. And just having him so close and then so they showed us the plot that they would give us. And I remember just being like, this is perfect. And it was springtime, and across the street is a like little farm that has goats and sheep.
Uh-huh.
You could hear the baby goats and sheep bleating in the distance, and the wind. I just remember that moment of standing there and just feeling so much peace, of being like, this is where he needs to be. And hearing those sounds, and just like the comfort that brought me of knowing that those sounds would be familiar to where he would be then. And every spring it's the same. Like every time around his birthday, you hear this new evidence of life, and that brings me some comfort as well. So that's what we picked. And we had a very small graveside service. We both knew that we could not have a funeral that seemed very overwhelming, like a formal funeral.
Right.
And invite people that were not family there. So we just had a very simple graveside service, and a couple of leadership position people in our church were there. Our bishop was there. Our stake president and his counselors were there. And our immediate family was there as well. And so that's all we invited to the graveside service. So, and I knew that I couldn't have his funeral in the actual chapel of our building,
right,
or anywhere in the building, because I knew I would still have to go back there every Sunday.
Yeah.
And I knew for me that was not going to be helpful to re-enter the doors of somewhere I last saw my child. So I'm glad that we made those decisions and just to keep it very small and intimate, because that's what felt right to us. So that's what we did. In the morning of his funeral, my milk came in. So he was born on the 25th and we had his funeral on the 28th. And I remember that morning I was supposed to have a haircut. And I never canceled it. But I just remember like getting ready to go to the funeral home and being like, I should be at a hair appointment right now. Yeah. But instead I'm going to my son's funeral. And just thinking how cruel that was. I remember both my husband and I wanting to look our best for our son. I remember we were both like, I want to look my absolute best for our child. And my husband, he is in the Army Reserves, and he also works for the Department of Defense. At the time, he worked for a private law firm, but we're military as well.
Yeah. Okay.
And so he got dressed in his blues, and he and I went to the funeral home on our own that morning to see our son. And the kids had made some Lego creations for Turner and had each picked out something just for him to put in his casket. We did not have the kids come to the funeral home with us. We thought it was enough what they had already been through, and they had the chance to see him already. And so we went with our little gifts from his siblings, from Turner's siblings, to the funeral home. I also wrote him a long letter just for him, and I braided a section of my hair and cut it off, and so that he could have a piece of me with him as well. I had a piece of his hair. I wanted him to have something of me with him. So we had a lot of things to put in his casket with him. And so we got there, and he looked absolutely beautiful again, because he was perfect.
Yeah.
And we spent about an hour with him at the funeral home. And I thought that I was going to get his gown and the blanket that he was in the hospital back. And so that's what we gave the funeral home. That's how we gave him to the funeral home, was in the gown and the blanket that he had worn in the hospital.
Yeah.
And I remember asking them, like, can I have his things back? And they said, no, you can't have those back. Like, we have to destroy those things.
Oh.
And I'm like, had I known that, I would have put him in something else.
Yeah.
But we had given them a gown and another blanket to wrap him in when we met with them before his funeral. And so he was in those things, but this one thing again, I wish I would have known.
Yeah.
But he looked beautiful and perfect, and we spent an hour with him. I brought the other blanket that the hospital gave me that was identical to the one that he was in, and tucked him in with that. And he had a blanket that both of our boys had used when they were babies that he was wrapped in.
Oh.
So we gave that to the funeral home along with another outfit that the hospital had given us. I did not have in our church, we have blessings.
Yes.
And I did not have a blessing outfit picked out for him because we didn't know if he was a boy or a girl. And I made my children's blessing outfits. I sewed those for them. And so I thought I had time to make that for him.
Yeah.
And now that I didn't have time, I knew I couldn't go into a store and pick out an outfit for my child to wear.
Yeah.
So we gave them another gown that the hospital gave us. And we tucked him in, and we both just were over his casket saying our goodbyes for a good hour. Lots and lots of tears, lots of I love yous, lots of saris. And we put all the little Lego creations by his feet. And my husband placed a pocket watch that his dad had given him, that he wanted to pass on to one of his sons eventually when they got older. But he gave it to Turner because he's like, I can't give him anything else important from me, and I want him to have this. And so he gave him the pocket watch from his dad. And then we both gave him our CTR rings that we had, that we wore like for years. So there's a pocket watch in one of his hands, and then the CTR ring and the lock of my hair in his other. And so he's got lots of love in there. And then that gray teddy bear Lovey that I got at my baby shower, I gave that to him as well, because I was so excited for him to have it. And I thought that would be the proper place for it to be.
Yeah, completely.
So we eventually said our goodbyes. I remember walking away from that casket was the hardest thing I've ever had to do besides give him away. Like physically telling myself, you need to turn around and walk away now. So I walked away first, and my husband walked away a couple of seconds after me. And then we headed over to the graveside service. We went home first, and then we went over there about an hour later, I think it was. And it was very simple. His graveside service is very simple but beautiful. I don't remember much of what was said, but I remember feeling a lot of peace. And my mom had bought a bouquet of roses because we didn't know what to do. And my mom's like, well, there's got to be flowers.
Good job, Mom.
Like, we didn't have enough mental capacity to order a beautiful thing for the top of the casket.
Yeah.
And, we just had no idea what to do. And so my mom at least thought enough to be, well, we have to have flowers. And so she went out and bought roses from the grocery store. And so we were each able to put a rose on the top of his casket. And my sister-in-law and my brother, who now live here, they came down from Virginia for his funeral. My other brothers who are in Wisconsin, I was just like, you don't have to come. And plus it's like a 17-hour drive. Yeah. I'm like, I know you would love to be here, but please don't do that. And, but Brandon and Katie were close enough that they were like, we're coming. Yeah. I don't care what you say. So, so they came, and they were there as well. And she took photos of the funeral itself. And I think we were both like, I don't know, but I'm glad that she did. And I'm glad I was like, okay, sure. I don't look at those photos as often, but I'm glad that I had them. Yeah. Because those are really hard for me to look at. But I'm glad I have them.
Yeah.
And then I remember we didn't watch him be buried. But I remember at some point it was done, and I was like, well, what do we do now? I remember sitting there and just being like, what do we do now?
Yeah.
And we were both like, okay, now I guess we go home. And so we went home, and that is like the start of the last 5 years.
Yeah.
That was just the whirlwind of the beauty of my pregnancy and the crazy, chaotic, heartbreaking experience of finding out he died and everything. But yeah.
I'm so sorry, Desiree.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for telling his story. And I'm hoping that we got some more information that you haven't been able to tell in the past. And but is there one last thing that you want to tell us about Turner?
he's had such a profound impact on me and our family. But he's just such a beautiful part of my life. He has been always, but especially now, 5 years later, like I can see the beauty in the pain. And I'm glad I'm at that point, but it's still so painful. But there's so much beauty there, and his life just has so much joy and what he means to our family. And he's impacted so many other people as well, which we'll talk about as well. So, but yeah, so he's impacted a lot of people, and just through the absolute heartbreak of losing him, we've been able to find a purpose and find meaning in the heartbreak. So yeah, I'm just grateful that I'm his mom. I think that's the most important thing. I'm grateful for all of my kids.
Yeah.
Right? But
of course,
I don't get to parent him here. And I'm so grateful to be his mom still, and to have that knowledge that he's always my son, even if he's not here. And so yeah, very blessed to have him be a part of our family.
Yeah. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Desiree.
Yeah. I'm glad I was able to share him finally.
Me too. I'm glad.
It's been a long time coming. I just didn't think I had the wherewithal to go through all the details until now. So yeah.
I'm glad we got to know him better today.
Yeah.